on social work. 6 core values of service, social justice, dignity and worth of the person, importance of human relationships, integrity, and competence. I mention these core ethics of social work because I believe these values must begin in my own home, within my own family, and to be ingrained with who I am as a person in order for those values to be carried over into my professional work. For this reason, I like to start by saying I'm first and foremost a wife with 26 years of marriage to my wonderful husband, a mother to 4 amazing children, and a grandmother to a precious baby that's due next month in June. We don't know the sex yet. You can go ahead and start. If you would want to please share the PowerPoint, you can bring it to that title page, would be wonderful. I have been working with children and families for over 25 years. These past 20 years have been dedicated to child welfare services at the Iowa Department of Health and Human Services, otherwise known as HHS. My experience with HHS started as a social work case manager. Then I was a supervisor of child protection in both rural and urban counties, and a social work supervisor in the intake unit. In my current role as the child protection policy program manager, I oversee statewide policy as it relates to child abuse intakes, assessments, and the Central Abuse Registry. I also serve as the HHS liaison for the Iowa Child Death Review Team and as the state liaison officer for the Children's Bureau, which is an office of the Administration for Children and Families within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Next slide, please. I'm going to give you a few seconds purposefully between each slide because I've learned in some adult learning research that it takes your brain about 3 to 4 seconds of quiet to be able to let what you just heard and saw absorb into your brain. So I'm intentionally having those pauses. So I'm sorry for anybody who finds silence to be awkward. In order to meet our objectives, it's beneficial to review some of the basics around the intake and assessment process. While you may or may not be familiar with the main aspects of Child Protective Services, I found that review and clarification is important to assure we all have the same understanding of how the system works on a general level so that we can have more fruitful conversations around how sexual assault and domestic violence intersects with child welfare. I also like to keep my presentations very informal when I can. So if you have questions along the way, as I already mentioned, feel free to ask them or put the question in the chat. And we'll also have plenty of time at the end for questions as well. Next slide, please. To give you a bit of history, Iowa's child abuse reporting and assessment laws were first enacted in 1978. Honestly, to me, that doesn't seem very long ago. As HHS was assigned the responsibility and legal authority to conduct an assessment of suspected abuse when it is alleged that the legal criteria for abuse has been met. We refer to this criteria as the 3 C's: child, caretaker, and category of abuse. In order for HHS to assign a report of suspected abuse, the alleged victim must be a child, the person alleged responsible must be a caretaker, and there must be an allegation that at least one of the 11 categories of child abuse have been committed. Next slide, please. Iowa law defines a child as being any person under 18 years of age. That one's the really simple one. Next slide, please. Iowa law defines a caretaker or person responsible for the care of a child as a parent, guardian, or foster parent, or as a relative or any other person with whom the child resides and whom assumes care or supervision of the child, an employee or agent of any public or private facility providing care for a child, and any person providing care for a child, but with whom the child does not reside, without reference to the duration of the care. So as you can see, Iowa holds a very, very wide open definition of caretaker. There are a few exceptions to this caretaker requirement that I will explain throughout these future slides. Next slide, please. Iowa law defines 11 categories of child abuse that you see here on the screen, and I will touch upon each of them in the following slides. Physical abuse is any non-accidental physical injury caused by the acts or omissions of a caretaker. Physical abuse made up 7% of all child abuse in calendar year 2023. Mental injury is an injury to a child's intellectual or psychological capacity as evidenced by an observable and substantial impairment in the child's ability to function within their normal range and as the result of the acts or omissions of a caretaker. Mental injury is one of our most difficult categories of abuse to substantiate because it does require a licensed physician or mental health professional confirm that a caretaker is directly causing the impairment in a child's ability to function within their normal range of performance and behavior. It is, however, not required for the report of suspected abuse to be made by a physician or mental health professional for the allegation to be accepted as an assessment. Anyone can make that report of suspected abuse. Examples of mental injury could include a child who has delays due to parental inattention, many times as a result of substance abuse, or a child with impairment in their ability to function as a result of domestic violence they are witnessing. In calendar year 2023, mental injury was one of the 6 categories that made up less than 1% of all child abuse. Next slide, please. Sexual abuse is the commission of a sexual offense with or to a child by a caretaker or a person who is 14 years of age or older and resides in a home with the child. There are 13 subcategories of sexual abuse. And we derive those categories by what's already defined in the criminal code. So those align with the child abuse code as well. And sexual abuse is the first category of abuse with an exception to the caretaker requirement that I mentioned earlier. As described in the definition of sexual abuse, in addition to the acts or omissions of the person responsible for the care of the child, sexual abuse may also be considered child abuse by any person 14 years of age or older who resides in a home with the child, even if they don't meet that caretaker standard. When considering sexual abuse, it's important to understand, as I'm sure you do, that not all sexual offenses involve the commission of a sex act, and that any sexual behavior between a caretaker and a child is child abuse. It's also important to avoid any assumption that sexual behavior is consensual just because a person is of an age in which they are able to give legal consent. Like physical abuse, this category can be by omission. That is, that the caretaker knew or should have reasonably known that the child was likely to be sexually abused and failed to protect the child. An example would include a case in which mother knew that her boyfriend sexually abused her child, but still left him as a caretaker, and he continued to sexually abuse the child. In circumstances in which a child has been exposed to danger of sexual abuse throughout the caretaker's omission, but no abuse has occurred yet, this would be considered as denial of critical care, failure to provide proper supervision. An example would include a case in which a parent knew her teenage child had sexually abused another child, yet leaves that teenage child as a caretaker to their younger siblings. In calendar year 2023, sexual abuse made up 4% of all child abuse. Next slide. Thank you. There are 8 subcategories. I'm sorry, denial of critical care. It's defined as the failure of a caretaker that occurred within the past 5 years to provide for the adequate food, shelter, clothing, medical or mental health treatment, supervision, or other care necessary for the child's health and welfare when financially able to do so, or when offered financial or other reasonable means to do so. This category is also referred to neglect and is accepted for assessment when a caretaker neglects to provide care that is adequate for the child's health and welfare. Historically, denial of critical care has remained our largest category of abuse, claiming 59% of all child abuse in calendar year 2023. Some common situations that fall under this category include concerns of illegal substance use or prescription abuse that impacts a child's health or welfare. Obvious impact would include substance use that's occurring while a child is present, even if that child may be in a separate room or another part of the house. That could look like a parent smoking pot in their bedroom while the children are playing in the living room. Even if substance use itself isn't in the presence of a child, it's important to consider when that person using substances is expected to be caring for a child again. Parents often tell us they're not using in front of a child, but then we learn that they're still under the effects of a substance when they resume care for their child. Substance use that occurs when children are not present could also pose risk to health and welfare when they return to the environment. If a parent leaves substances or paraphernalia in a location that's accessible to children, for example, or if methamphetamine has been manufactured at the child's home or in a vehicle they are transported in, or if cocaine is used on a surface of the home that's accessible by the children, it could be absorbed through their skin upon contact. Denial of critical care also includes children being left home alone who do not have the ability to care for themselves. While Iowa law does not define a specific age for a child to be left home alone, it is important to consider whether the child has a physical or mental disability, if they're comfortable being alone, whether they know how to respond in the event of an emergency, if they have access to a phone and know how to use it, if they know how to reach a caretaker, and of course, how long they're going to be alone must be considered as well. Truancy alone is not child abuse. However, a child may have a special need to be in school because of a diagnosed disability, where they receive specialized services to meet their needs during the school day. When these children do not attend school, they do not receive those needed services, and this could be denial of critical care. When it comes to concerns with children riding in motor vehicles, Iowa law does not consider an unrestrained child to be child abuse in and of itself. However, we do not need to wait for a child to be injured in a motor vehicle for there to be abuse. If the life or health of a child is in danger, for example, a person driving recklessly while a child is in the vehicle, or a person driving under the influence of substances, could be denial of critical care as well. There are 8 subcategories of denial of critical care, and those include the list that you see here on your screen: food and nutrition, shelter, clothing, healthcare, mental health care, failure to meet emotional needs, proper supervision, and response to an infant's life-threatening condition. Those first 4 failures must be to such an extent that there is danger of the child suffering injury or death. Whereas failure to provide adequate supervision just has to result in the direct harm or create a risk of harm to the child, which is why supervision would be our largest category or subcategory of denial of critical care that we see. As you can imagine, substance use and mental health concerns are common factors in the majority of neglect cases that we see. Prostitution of a child would be assessed when there is a reasonable belief that a caretaker allows, permits, or encourages a child to engage in a sex act in exchange for money or other goods or services. This category of abuse is utilized less frequently since the implementation of child sex trafficking category that I will talk about shortly. In calendar year 2023, prostitution of a child was one of the 6 categories that made up less than 1% of all child abuse. And I know historically we've referred to this category as child prostitution. And so years ago, we made a thoughtful decision to change this category's reference to prostitution of a child because of our understanding and what we've learned through human trafficking, that of course, no child can be a prostitute. So that was the biggest change that we've seen here in this category, is how we reference it. But it is still on the books, so we'll still continue to have it on as a category of abuse as long as it's defined within the law. Presence of illegal drugs, we also refer to this as PID or PIDs, occurs when an illegal drug is present in a child's body as a direct and foreseeable consequence of the acts or omissions of the caretaker. Most commonly, we see the PID category as a result of prenatal exposure. A pregnant mother, for example, uses an illegal drug and it results in their child being born with the illegal drug in their body. Children are also exposed to postnatal in circumstances such as a mother who uses illegal drugs and passes it to the child through her breast milk, or a caretaker who allows a child to be in an environment where the child is exposed to the illegal drug usage or has access to ingest the illegal drug. Presence of illegal drugs made up 9% of all abuse in calendar year 2023. Dangerous substance is the category of abuse that was most recently modified in 2017 and was previously known as manufacturing or possession of a dangerous substance, and really was focused on methamphetamine. Today, dangerous substance occurs when the person responsible for the care of a child does any of the following within 5 years of a report to HHS. In the presence of a child, unlawfully uses, possesses, manufactures, cultivates, or distributes a dangerous substance, or knowingly allows the same by another person, or possesses a product with the intent to use the product as a precursor or intermediary to a dangerous substance in the presence of a child. Dangerous substance also occurs when the person responsible for the care of a child unlawfully uses, possesses, manufactures, cultivates, or distributes amphetamine, methamphetamine, or a chemical combination of chemicals that are used or intended to be used in the manufacturing of an illegal or controlled substance in a child's home, on the premises, or in a motor vehicle located on the premises, even if a child was not present. Dangerous substance is the second largest category of abuse it's the second category of abuse that has an exception to the caretaker requirement. While the dangerous substance category can only be considered child abuse when the person responsible is a caretaker, HHS is required to open a child in need of assistance assessment if the person responsible for the dangerous substance is another adult member of the household in which the child resides. So this would be another adult member who is not a caretaker. Dangerous substance is our second largest category of abuse and totaled 20% of all child abuse in calendar year 2023. So I've included the full definition of dangerous substance, but as you can see more clearly in the bolded font, dangerous substance includes amphetamines, methamphetamines, chemicals used to make illegal or controlled substances, cocaine, heroin, and opium or opiates. The dangerous substance category requires unlawful use, possession, manufacture, cultivation, or distribution of a dangerous substance, or knowingly allowing such activity by another person in the presence of a child or possessing the product with the intent to use the product as a precursor in the presence of a child. So for the purpose of this category of abuse, in the presence of a child means literally in the physical presence of a child, or occurring under other circumstances in which a reasonably and prudent person would know that use, possession, manufacture, cultivation, or distribution may be seen, smelled, ingested, or heard by a child. And the reason that that definition came about, because we were having a lot of cases fall through the cracks because, there were arguments that, well, the child wasn't physically present. They were doing this in a garage or in their basement or, somewhere where the child's not always accessing or maybe not supposed to be accessing. The second part of this definition means that a child doesn't have to be standing in the mix of the use, possession, manufacturing, etc. If the child's in another room, on another level of the home, or even outside at the time of the use, possession, manufacturing, cultivation, or distribution, that is in the presence of a child. Bestiality in the presence of a minor is assessed when there is reasonable belief that a sex act between a person and an animal occurred in front of a child, and that the caretaker either committed the acts or allowed another person who resides in the home to commit the acts in front of the child. In calendar year 2023, bestiality in the presence of a minor, thank goodness, was one of the 6 categories that made up less than 1% of all child abuse. Allows access to a registered sex offender is defined as knowingly allowing a person custody or control of or unsupervised access to a child or minor after knowing the person is required to register or is on the sex offender registry. This category does not apply when the registered sex offender is the child's parent or guardian, or the registered sex offender is married to and living with the child's parent or guardian, or the sex offender is a minor child living with their own parent, guardian, or foster parent. In calendar year 2023, allows access to a registered sex offender was, again, one of the 6 categories that made up less than 1% of all child abuse. Allows access to obscene material occurs when the caretaker knowingly allows the child access to obscene material or has knowingly disseminated or exhibited such material to the child. Iowa Code defines obscene material as any material depicting or describing genitals, sex acts, masturbation, excretory functions, or sadomasochistic abuse, which the average person taking the material as a whole and applying contemporary community standards with respect to what is suitable material for minors would find appeals to the prurient interest and is patently offensive, and the material taken as a whole lacks serious literary, scientific, political, or artistic value. So obviously this definition is a mouthful, but it's its intent is to not keep a parent or caretaker from providing age appropriate, sexual education to a child, but to, have that line drawn that it would be outside of that purpose. In calendar year 2023, allows access to obscene material was one of those 6 categories that made up less than 1% of all child abuse. Our 11th and final category of child abuse is child sex trafficking, which is defined as the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining, patronizing, or soliciting of a child for the purpose of commercial sexual activity. Now, commercial sexual activity means any sex act or sexually explicit performance for which anything of value is given promised to or received by any person, not just the child or the person who set it up, but any person, and includes, but is not limited to, prostitution, participation in the production of pornography, and performance in strip clubs. Child sex trafficking is the third category of abuse, with an exception to the caretaker requirement, in that any person responsible for any part of trafficking a child for commercial sexual activity is considered child abuse. In calendar year 2023, child sex trafficking was one of those 6 categories that made up less than 1% of all child abuse. And what I would say about that statistic is, I feel like we're off the mark on that one. I feel like child sex trafficking is something that is highly misunderstood, is highly, I don't want to say ignored, but it's definitely not, people are not educated enough about what this looks like and who these victims are. And I think we are overlooking a lot of these kiddos. Adding to the complication that when we do identify these victims or potential victims, they are not willing to identify themselves as victims or potential victims. And it's really hard for us to even substantiate a preponderance of evidence, which is all we need to say that abuse occurred, more likely than not. So we have a long ways to go in our education on this category of abuse. Reports of suspected abuse are called into the HHS abuse hotline. As of January 2021, all calls to the HHS abuse hotline are processed by our centralized service intake unit. This unit is comprised of social workers who are dedicated to taking calls, and they do not carry caseloads. All reports of suspected abuse are written up as an intake. A decision to reject or accept an intake is made based upon the 3 C's criteria that I reviewed. So if the alleged victim is not a child, if the person alleged responsible is not a caretaker, with the exceptions I mentioned for sexual abuse, dangerous substance, and child sex trafficking, or if the allegation does not meet a category of abuse as defined by Iowa law, then that intake is rejected. Rejected intake information is always considered for the appropriateness of a child in need of assistance assessment, and is also referred to any HHS program that may have involvement with any of the subjects of the intake. So a social work case manager, for example, would receive the intake information regarding any child or family in which they have an open service case for. Rejected intake information is also referred to law enforcement when there is an alleged criminal act harming a child. We're normally involved with law enforcement on the majority of those cases, but an example would include an allegation of sexual abuse to a person who is 18 years of age or older, since of course that's outside of our purview, or where the person alleged responsible is not a caretaker or household member who is 14 years of age or older. Rejected intakes are maintained for 3 years, and HHS is able to use this information to assist in making a determination on any future calls, and we do. And it's really important to say, because sometimes people don't call because they are afraid, like, well, it's not going to be enough. They're going to think I'm silly for calling this in because it's just this little bit of information. But honestly, many of our reports are actually accepted based on information that we can ascertain from other reports that were made. So sometimes these intakes are like little pieces of puzzles, and we might have one little piece of puzzle here and one little piece of puzzle here. But then once we get enough of those pieces together, we can start to see a more holistic picture that tells us that there's something wrong here and that we need to intervene if in fact those allegations are true. So on the other hand, if the alleged victim is a child, if the person alleged responsible is a caretaker or meets one of those caretaker exceptions, and if the allegation meets a category of abuse as defined by Iowa law, then the intake is accepted. An accepted intake is assigned as a child protective assessment, and we have two types of those assessments. We have the family assessment and the child abuse assessment. Next slide, please. For every report of suspected abuse, there are standard questions we ask despite the type of abuse being reported. Questions related to sexual assault or domestic violence include inquiry about what the reporter knows and how they know it, where the child is currently, when they will next have contact with the person alleged responsible, what school or child care the child may attend, any knowledge of domestic violence, substance use, or human trafficking the reporter may be aware of, other individuals that could be contacted about knowledge they have of the concerns, and any history of abuse or criminal activity. When a call is made to our intake unit, the reporter is not required to have proof that the abuse occurred. For a report of suspected abuse to be accepted for assessment, there only needs to be a reasonable belief that the 3 C's criteria is met. That we have a child, a caretaker, and a category of abuse. So as long as that information is reasonable, you reasonably believe that those 3 things are met, it meets our standard for acceptance. But again, that you don't have to have proof of that when you're making a call. You just have to have a reasonable belief that it is true. A screening tool based on Iowa law and administrative rule is utilized to determine if the accepted intake must be assigned as a family assessment or a child abuse assessment. So there's not a whole subjectivity to this process. The path is pretty clearly laid out of you must accept a family assessment when it's this, and you must accept a child abuse assessment when this is present. So the 12 items listed on this slide are the criteria set forth in Iowa law and rule. So if any of the criteria on this slide are met, the accepted allegation is not eligible for a family assessment and must be assigned as a child abuse assessment. So obviously the intent of this these criteria were really meant to identify less serious allegations of abuse and allegations that are focused on the caretakers, the parents, the household, the parents, and much less on people outside of that child's family. This, just to give you an example of the breakdown real quick, you can keep it on this slide, but just to kind of give you an example of how that breaks out, in 2023, we conducted 32,857 child protective assessments. 6,244 of those, or 19%, were assigned as a family assessment. And the remaining 26,613 of them, which is 81% of them, were accepted as child abuse assessments. So once the assessment type is determined, and there are a few notifications that must take place. So while child abuse information is confidential, there are times when information is allowed or even required to be shared. During the intake process, HHS is required to notify the reporter, and that's whether they're mandatory or permissive, so all reporters, about whether the report of suspected abuse they made was rejected or accepted for assessment. This notification is provided to the reporter verbally before they end the call, and also in writing, provided the reporter leaves their name and contact information. So that's something important if you're ever assisting in a call or making a call yourself, and for some reason the worker doesn't tell you whether or not it's going to be accepted, please feel like you can ask that. Hey, can you tell me if this is going to be accepted or rejected? Because they are required to give you that information. That doesn't mean it won't change. There are circumstances where an intake worker believes it meets the criteria, and then once reviewed by a supervisor, it's determined that no, in fact, the criteria is not met, or vice versa. The intake worker thought it was going to be rejected, and the supervisor reviews it and says, no, that's going to be accepted for assessment. And in those cases, they would give you a call back and let you know, like, I'm sorry, I told you it was going to be rejected, but it's actually going to be accepted, or vice versa. The appropriate HHS service area is notified of the accepted intake so that they may assign a child protection worker to the assessment. Parents are also notified when an intake is accepted for assessment as it relates to their child. This notification is provided in writing and also in person as the child protection worker initiates their assessment. I think it's really important to note here, especially for your purposes, that if you're not already aware, the reporter is always held confidential. That is not information that we ever do or can legally share with a subject of the report. So a lot of times, we'll have a parent say, well, I know my ex-wife called this in because they're mad about this, or, there's always some reason somebody believes somebody else is calling in on them. And some of that might be true, but it doesn't mean that the allegations aren't true. So I think it's important to note that we do not reveal the identity of the reporter to any of the subjects of the report. Finally, the county attorney and juvenile court are notified of every intake in their respective counties, whether those reports are accepted or rejected, because they do have the ability to take action on those, even if we do not. So if you're a visual learner like I am, you will appreciate this slide. It depicts the intake process as a whole. All calls filter through the HHS abuse hotline, as you'll see. Reports of suspected abuse are written up as an intake. The intake is either accepted or rejected for assessment. If the intake's rejected, appropriate referrals are made and the information is maintained for 3 years. If the intake is accepted, it's assigned as either a family assessment or a child abuse assessment. So what is the difference between a child abuse assessment and a family assessment? Generally speaking, a child abuse assessment prioritizes the assessment of the child's safety and evaluates risk factors that are present which make a family more vulnerable to future abuse. In a child abuse assessment, safety is typically addressed within 24 hours from the time of the report of suspected abuse. However, if a child is believed to be in imminent danger, safety is addressed within 1 hour. A determination of whether or not the alleged abuse is substantiated is placed upon the child abuse registry is also part of that child abuse assessment. A written child abuse assessment report is required within 20 days, 20 business days, that is, and the report must include recommendations for intervention. Any report that is founded with low, moderate, or high risk, or if it's confirmed with high risk, it is referred for formal HHS services. In the family assessment, you see that the safety of the child is also prioritized and risk factors are also evaluated to determine the family's vulnerability to future abuse. In a family assessment, safety is addressed within 72 hours as opposed to the 24 hours from the time the report of suspect abuse was made. The biggest difference in a family assessment is that there is no determination of whether or not the alleged abuse is substantiated. This is because family assessments involve less serious allegations of abuse and provide an alternate response for a family to correct the issues that brought them to HHS's attention without concern of the abuse being placed on the Central Abuse Registry. A written report for a family assessment is due within 10 business days. That information is gathered from the assessment, helps guide whether there are recommendations for intervention appropriate for the family. These interventions would include voluntary services that are available in the community, and do not include formal HHS involvement or court oversight. So this is another visual depiction of the commonalities and differences in a child abuse assessment versus a family assessment. As you will note, the first commonality is safety first and foremost. A validated, structured decision-making tool that we call a safety assessment is used to assess at a point in time whether a child is likely to be in imminent danger of serious harm or maltreatment, which requires a safety intervention, and to determine what intervention should be initiated or maintained to provide appropriate protection. Danger indicators are behaviors or conditions that describe a child being in imminent danger of serious harm. Physical living conditions that are hazardous and immediately threatening the safety of a child and or safety, for example, would be a danger indicator. Child's vulnerability is the degree to which a child cannot avoid, negate, or minimize the impact of the danger. A child's age, their developmental level, and any physical impairment or mental health conditions, for example, impact a child's level of vulnerability. So for the example I just gave of living conditions being hazardous and immediately threatening to a child would look very different, to a teenager versus an infant or toddler. Safety interventions are the family strengths or resources that reduce, control, or prevent danger indicators from arising. Having the alleged person responsible leave the home and utilizing family supports as well as services by the department, for example, could assist to reduce danger indicators. Next slide, please. Oh, no, you're on it. Sorry. At the conclusion of a safety assessment, after the assessment of all danger indicators, child vulnerability, and all safety interventions, there are 3 possible outcomes. The child is either safe and no further action to address safety needs to be taken, or the child is safe with a plan and a safety plan is required to address safety, or the child is unsafe and the circumstances require the child to be removed. It is important to note that in a family assessment, the child must be safe by the close of the assessment. If not, the family assessment is required by law to be reassigned to a child abuse assessment. In a child abuse assessment, the child protection worker must also determine whether or not abuse is substantiated. To accomplish this, evidence is collected and evaluated through observation, interviews with the child victim, their parents, the alleged person responsible, and any other person who may have information regarding the alleged abuse. These additional persons often include school, law enforcement, medical personnel, and certainly would include important roles such as you as advocates. To substantiate abuse, there must be a preponderance of evidence, meaning the evidence must be of greater weight or more convincing than the evidence which is offered in opposition to it. As you can compare in this illustration, the burden of proof in a child abuse assessment is preponderance and requires the evidence to be at least 51% to substantiate. Most criminal evidence, on the other hand, is required to be clear and convincing or beyond a reasonable doubt to prove guilt. This explains why there are times in which HHS is able to substantiate abuse, but there may not be enough evidence for law enforcement to criminally prosecute. When HHS makes a determination as to whether or not abuse occurred, there are 3 possible outcomes: not confirmed, confirmed, or founded. Not confirmed means there was not a preponderance of evidence to suggest the abuse occurred, and therefore the incident is not placed on the Central Abuse Registry. Confirmed means that there was a preponderance of evidence to suggest abuse occurred, but the incident was minor and isolated and unlikely to recur. The law allows only 3 types of abuse to be confirmed, and those are physical abuse, and then 2 subcategories of denial of critical care. Those are failure to provide proper supervision and failure to provide adequate clothing. When an incident is confirmed, the abuse is substantiated, but the incident is not placed on the Central Abuse Registry. Founded, on the other hand, means that there was a preponderance of evidence to suggest abuse occurred, and therefore the incident is placed on the Central Abuse Registry. Founded abuse remains on the registry for 10 years, although there are circumstances that allow a person named to be removed from the registry after 5 years. And there are also circumstances that allow a person under the age of age of 14 who has substantiated abuse against them to have their name withheld from the registry. So those are very important caveats to understand. Following an assessment, the child protection worker makes a recommendation for services by analyzing safety and risk factors affecting the child and family, identifying what available services are appropriate for the child and family, and determining whether formal HHS child welfare services and court involvement are needed for the child and family. Recommended interventions may include information provided to the family or referral to services available within the community, or non-agency voluntary services. And these are services that we contract with community agencies to provide directly to families, or formal HHS case management services, which may include additional contracted family-centered services. And finally, court involvement, including adjudication as a child in need of assistance and possibly criminal court action. At the conclusion of an assessment, there are additional notifications that must take place. As stated earlier, although child abuse is confidential, child abuse information is confidential, there are times when information is allowed or even required to be shared. Following the assessment process, HHS is required to notify all subjects and the mandatory reporter about the outcome of the assessment. So you notice that does not include reporters who are not mandatory reporters. If you were a permissive reporter, you would not receive an outcome notice. This notice would inform whether the report was not confirmed, or founded. Subjects of a report who would receive this include a child named in the report as a victim of abuse, or the child's attorney or guardian ad litem, a parent or attorney for the parent of a child named in the report as a victim of abuse, a guardian or legal custodian of that person, or that person's attorney of a child named in the report as a victim of abuse, and a person or the attorney for the person named in the report as having abused a child, also referred to as a perpetrator. All subjects receive a copy of the written assessment report, and mandatory reporters may request a copy of any founded report. We have had some discussion about whether or not the continuation of written reports were going to be sent out to families. That's still in discussion right now, but if you ever come across a circumstance where a family receives the outcome notice, but they do not get a copy of the written assessment report, the back of that notice tells them exactly how they go about getting a copy of that report. It's a really easy process. They just request that copy, or they can go down to a local office if it's more convenient, but they can request that electronically as well to get a copy of those reports. And as with intakes, county attorneys and juvenile court are notified of these assessments that relate to their respective counties. So here's the flow chart again. Again, this provides that overview of the entire process from intake through assessment and services. So to review, that right side of the chart shows the family assessment process, observations made within 72 hours, a safety and risk assessment is completed, a written report regarding abuse is completed within 10 business days. If the child's safe in the conclusion of the family assessment, then recommendations for appropriate services are made. If the child is not safe at the conclusion of the family assessment, the incident is reassigned to a child abuse assessment. The left side of that chart shows you that child abuse assessment process. Observation of the child's made within 24 hours or 1 hour if there's immediate danger. A safety and risk assessment is completed. A written report regarding the alleged abuse is completed within 20 business days. There's a disposition or finding as to whether or not abuse is substantiated, and recommendations for appropriate services are made. I know you'll have an opportunity following this training to ask specific questions about your role as an advocate, and I've included the 2 contacts you can reach out to directly for those types of questions following this presentation. And then finally, I know I've reviewed a lot of information in a short amount of time. Child welfare, especially our intake and assessment process, is very complicated. I know it's not to me, but I know it is when it's not something you live and breathe every day. So I hope that you all have a better understanding about the intake and assessment process of child abuse. But certainly if there's questions, I'll be happy to take those that you have at this time. You're welcome to also contact me if you're, afterwards, if there are specific questions about child abuse policy or procedure. I'm more than happy to answer questions in the future as well.
Thank you, Roxanne. Does anyone have any questions for Roxanne? I also put her email in the chat. So if you do have any questions, you can feel free to unmute, raise your hand, whatever you want to do. If you'd rather ask it anonymously, you can message myself, Anna, or Kirsten in the chat. So give you all a couple minutes. See if anyone has any questions. Okay. Hearing none. Roxanne, I think you are free to go. If anything else comes up, we can message you or email you and get those questions to the advocates. Thank you so much for your time. I will stop recording as well.